Marcus Hayes stood outside the ornate doors of Clearview Academy, feeling the weight of 1,000 judgments before he even stepped inside. The autumn breeze rustled through the manicured hedges, carrying with it the scent of privilege and exclusivity. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The foyer gleamed with polished marble and gilt-framed portraits of stern-faced benefactors. Marcus's footsteps echoed in the cavernous space as he approached the reception desk. "Can I help you?" The receptionist's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm here for the parent-teacher meeting. Marcus Hayes." Her brow furrowed as she scanned the list. "I'm sorry, I don't see your name here. Are you sure you have the right day?" Marcus maintained his composure. "I'm certain. My daughter, Jasmine Hayes, is a student here." The receptionist's lips thinned. "One moment, please." As she made a call, Marcus caught snippets of whispered conversations from passing staff members. Their sidelong glances spoke volumes. "Is there a problem?" A crisp voice cut through the tension. Marcus turned to face a woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun. Her name tag read, Mrs. Evelyn Granger, head administrator. "No problem, Mrs. Granger," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm here for the parent-teacher meeting." Mrs. Granger's eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid there must be some mistake. This meeting is for parents of our students." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, but kept his voice steady. "My daughter, Jasmine Hayes, is a student here. I have every right to attend this meeting." Mrs. Granger's lips pursed. "I see. Well, Mr. Hayes, I'm not sure how you managed to enroll your daughter here, but is there an issue?" A tall man with graying temples approached, his tweed jacket reeking of academic superiority. "Mr. Benson," Mrs. Granger addressed him, "this gentleman claims to be the parent of one of our students." Mr. Benson's eyes raked over Marcus, lingering on his impeccably tailored suit. "I find that hard to believe. Perhaps you're lost, sir." Marcus's patience wore thin. "I am not lost, and I am not leaving. My daughter attends a school, and I have every right to be here." A crowd had begun to gather, curious onlookers whispering among themselves. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken assumptions hanging heavy in the air. "Now, see here," Mr. Benson began, his voice rising. "No, you see here," Marcus interrupted, his tone firm but controlled. "I will not be intimidated or dismissed. I am a parent, and I will attend this meeting." Mrs. Granger's face flushed. "Mr. Hayes, I must insist that you leave. You're causing a disturbance." Marcus stood his ground. "The only disturbance here is the blatant discrimination I'm facing. I won't leave, but I'll wait in the hallway until the meeting begins." He turned on his heel and strode toward a nearby bench, leaving Mrs. Granger and Mr. Benson sputtering in his wake. As he sat, he overheard their hushed conversation. "Can you believe the audacity?" Mrs. Granger hissed. Mr. Benson shook his head. "It's a sign of the times, Evelyn. We must be vigilant in maintaining our standards." Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from Angela. "How's it going? Jasmine says hi." He smiled, thinking of his daughter's bright eyes and infectious laugh. They'd sacrificed so much to give her this opportunity, enduring countless microaggressions and veiled insults. But Jasmine was thriving academically, even if socially. Well, that was another matter. As parents began to file in for the meeting, Marcus caught snippets of their conversations. "Did you hear about the new superintendent? I hope they don't try to change things too much. We need to preserve the school's legacy." Marcus's ears perked up. He hadn't heard about a new superintendent. As he pondered this, a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. Mrs. Granger's voice rang out, sickeningly sweet. "Oh, Mr. Whitmore, we're so glad you could make it." A portly man in an expensive suit waved her off. "Sorry I'm late, Evelyn. Traffic was a nightmare. Shall we begin?" The crowd began to move into the meeting room. Marcus stood, ready to follow, when Mrs. Granger blocked his path. "Mr. Hayes, I thought I made myself clear. This meeting is for parents." Marcus finished for her. "Which I am. Now, if you'll excuse me." He brushed past her, ignoring her indignant sputter. As he entered the room, he felt the weight of every gaze upon him. He took a seat near the back, determined to weather whatever storm was coming. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our new superintendent. He comes highly recommended and has some exciting ideas for our school's future. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marcus leaned forward, curious. Without further ado, Mr. Whitmore continued, I'd like to introduce. The door burst open, and a security guard entered, followed by Mrs. Granger. There he is, she pointed at Marcus. That's the man causing the disturbance. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Marcus, who slowly stood. Mr. Whitmore looked confused. I'm sorry, what's going on here? Mrs. Granger's face was flushed with triumph. This man has no right to be here. He's not a parent, and he's refusing to leave. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Mr. Whitmore beat him to it. Not a parent. He chuckled. My dear Mrs. Granger, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is Marcus Hayes, our new superintendent. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Granger's face drained of color. Mr. Benson, who had been smirking near the front of the room, suddenly looked as if he'd swallowed a lemon. Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I apologize for any confusion. I thought it best to experience the school as a parent before revealing my position. He turned to address the stunned audience. What I've experienced today has been enlightening. It's clear that Clearview Academy has a proud tradition, but it's also clear that we have work to do. Mrs. Granger stammered. Mr. Hayes, we had no idea. Marcus held up a hand. No need to explain, Mrs. Granger. Your actions have spoken volumes. Now, shall we begin the meeting? We have much to discuss about the future of our school. As Marcus took his place at the front of the room, he caught sight of Mr. Benson whispering furiously to Mrs. Granger. Their panicked expressions told him all he needed to know about the challenges that lay ahead. But as he thought of Jasmine, of all the children who deserved a fair shot at success, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready for the fight. Good evening, everyone, he began, his voice strong and clear. I'm Marcus Hayes, your new superintendent, and we have a lot of work to do. The room buzzed with tension and anticipation. Marcus could feel the weight of expectations, prejudices, and fear pressing down on him. But he stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. As he launched into his vision for the school, Marcus caught sight of a familiar face peeking through the door's window. Jasmine's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with pride as she watched her father command a room. In that moment, Marcus knew that every struggle, every indignity he'd faced had been worth it. For Jasmine, for every child who'd ever felt out of place, he would transform this school into a place of true learning and acceptance. The battle had just begun, but Marcus Hayes was ready. With each word, each proposal, he chipped away at the walls of prejudice that had stood for far too long. And as the meeting progressed, he could see the first cracks beginning to form in the facade of Clearview Academy's outdated traditions. The stunned silence that followed Marcus's introduction as the new superintendent hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Granger's face had drained of color, while Mr. Benson's jaw clenched tight enough to crack walnuts. Marcus took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battle ahead. Now that we've cleared up any misunderstandings, Marcus began, his voice steady, let's discuss the future of Clearview Academy. He outlined his vision for a more inclusive, diverse school environment. With each word, the tension in the room ratcheted up a notch. Parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging worried glances. Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Granger interrupted, her voice sickly sweet, while your ideas are interesting, we must consider the school's legacy. Marcus met her gaze. And what legacy is that, Mrs. Granger? One of exclusion. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mr. Benson stood, his face flushed. Now see here, Hayes. This school has a proud tradition. Of what? Marcus challenged. of turning away talented students because they don't fit a certain mold, of allowing subtle bullying to go unchecked. The room erupted into chaos. Parents shouted over each other, some defending the status quo, others hesitantly supporting Marcus's ideas. Through it all, Marcus remained calm, a steady presence in the storm. As the meeting adjourned, Marcus caught snippets of hushed conversations. Can you believe they hired him? What about our children's safety? Maybe it's time for a change. He sighed, knowing the real work was just beginning. The following weeks were a blur of meetings, policy revisions, and thinly veiled resistance. Marcus found himself constantly battling against an invisible current of opposition. One morning, he arrived at his office to find a stack of papers missing from his desk. Crucial documents detailing his proposed changes had vanished overnight. "Mrs. Granger," he called out, "have you seen the diversity initiative papers I left here yesterday?" She appeared in his doorway, all innocence. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. I haven't seen anything. Perhaps you misplaced them." Marcus's eyes narrowed. Perhaps. Later that day, Jasmine approached him after school, her eyes downcast. "Dad, can we talk?" Marcus's heart clenched. "Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong?" Jasmine hesitated. "My history project. Mr. Benson gave me a C. He said my research on black inventors wasn't relevant to the curriculum." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but kept his voice calm. "I see. We'll sort this out, Jasmine. I promise." As he watched his daughter walk away, Marcus realized the fight had become personal. It wasn't just about changing policies. It was about creating a world where Jasmine, and every child like her, could thrive. The school board meeting was tense from the start. Marcus presented his first round of reforms, focusing on diversifying the curriculum and implementing anti-bullying measures. Mrs. Granger's hand shot up. "Mr. Hayes, while these ideas are progressive, we must consider the impact on our traditional students." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Traditional students, Mrs. Granger? And who might those be?" Mr. Benson jumped in. "Students who value the school's long-standing traditions. We can't simply throw away years of excellence to appease a vocal minority." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "Mr. Benson, Mrs. Granger, I've been patient. I've listened to your concerns. But I can no longer ignore the blatant discrimination happening in this school." He turned to address the entire board. "We have talented students being marginalized. We have a curriculum that ignores vast swaths of history and culture. And we have staff members actively resisting positive change." Mrs. Granger's face flushed crimson. "How dare you accuse us?" "I dare," Marcus cut her off, "because it's the truth. And it's my job to ensure every student at Clearview receives an equitable, excellent education." The argument escalated, voices rising. Mr. Benson stood, jabbing a finger in Marcus's direction. "You're destroying everything we've built." Marcus remained seated, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Mr. Benson's agitation. "No, Mr. Benson, I'm building something better, something inclusive, something just." The board members watched the exchange, wide-eyed. As the shouting match reached a fever pitch, Marcus raised his hand. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We're here to vote on these reforms. All in favor?" Slowly, hesitantly, hands began to rise. Mrs. Granger and Mr. Benson watched in disbelief as, one by one, the board members sided with Marcus. The reforms passed. As the meeting adjourned, Marcus caught sight of Mrs. Granger and Mr. Benson huddled in a corner, whispering furiously. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The next few weeks brought a flurry of changes to Clearview Academy. New books appeared in the library, reflecting a broader range of experiences. Guest speakers from diverse backgrounds were invited to address the students. Anti-bullying workshops were implemented, but with each step forward, Marcus felt increasing pushback. Meetings were mysteriously rescheduled at the last minute. Equipment for new programs went missing, and the whispers in the hallways grew louder. One afternoon, As Marcus was leaving his office, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "Benson's got a plan," a voice hissed. "He's rallying the parents. Says Hayes is ruining the school's reputation. They're going to force him out." Marcus's mind raced. He had suspected resistance, but this was a full-blown conspiracy. That night, as he sat at the dinner table with Angela and Jasmine, Marcus felt the weight of his position more than ever. "Dad," Jasmine said quietly, "some of the kids at school, they're saying mean things. About you. About us." Angela reached across the table, squeezing Marcus's hand. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but we're in this together." Marcus nodded, his resolve strengthening. He had fought too hard, come too far, to back down now. The next morning, Marcus arrived at school early, determined to confront Mr. Benson. But as he approached the teacher's lounge, he heard raised voices. "We can't let him destroy everything we've built." Mr. Benson's voice carried through the door. "Patience, Harold," Mrs. Granger replied. "We have more support than you realize. Soon, Hayes will be nothing but a bad memory." Marcus's heart pounded. The conspiracy ran deeper than he had imagined. Mrs. Granger, who had been playing at reluctant cooperation, was in on it too. As he turned to leave, Marcus bumped into a parent he recognized from the PDA. The woman's eyes widened in recognition, then darted nervously toward the teacher's lounge. "Mr. Hayes," she whispered, "we need to talk. Not here. It's about Mr. Benson and Mrs. Granger. There's more going on than you know." Marcus nodded, hope flaring in his chest. Perhaps he had found an unexpected ally in this fight. As he walked away, Marcus's mind raced with possibilities. He had uncovered a conspiracy, yes, but he had also discovered that not everyone at Clearview was against him. There were parents, students, and even staff members who believed in his vision for a better school. The battle ahead would be difficult, but Marcus Hayes was ready. For Jasmine, for every student who had ever felt out of place, he would see this through. Clearview Academy was about to learn a lesson in justice, equality, and the power of perseverance. And as for Mr. Benson and Mrs. Granger, well, they were about to discover that underestimating Marcus Hayes was the biggest mistake they could have made. Marcus Hayes stood at the podium, his fingers gripping the edges as he surveyed the packed auditorium. The annual school assembly buzzed with nervous energy, a powder keg ready to ignite. He caught sight of Jasmine in the third row, her eyes wide with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "Clearview Academy," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut, "has always prided itself on excellence. But true excellence isn't just about test scores or Ivy League acceptances. It's about creating an environment where every student can thrive." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marcus pressed on, outlining his vision for a more inclusive, diverse Clearview. With each word, he could feel the resistance growing, like a physical force pushing against him. From the corner of his eye, he saw Mr. Benson shift in his seat, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Mrs. Granger sat beside him, her face a mask of polite interest that didn't reach her eyes. As Marcus concluded his speech, a hand shot up from the audience. It belonged to Richard Thornton, one of school's most influential donors. "Mr. Hayes," Thornton's voice dripped with condescension, "while your ideas are interesting, I'm concerned about the impact on our school's reputation. How can we maintain our standards if we lower the bar for admission?" The auditorium fell silent, all eyes on Marcus. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battle ahead. "Mr. Thornton, I appreciate your concern, but I must ask, what exactly do you mean by lowering the bar?" Thornton's face flushed. "Well, I mean, we can't just let anyone in." "Anyone?" Marcus's voice was quiet, but carried throughout the room. "Or just anyone who doesn't look like the majority of our current student body." The tension in the room was palpable. Jasmine shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and Marcus felt a pang of guilt for dragging her into this fight. Mr. Benson stood abruptly. "Now see here, Hayes. You can't just accuse our parents of racism. They have legitimate concerns about maintaining Clearview's legacy." Marcus turned to face him, his patience wearing thin. And what legacy is that, Mr. Benson? One of exclusion, of turning a blind eye to bullying, of denying opportunities to talented students because they don't fit a certain mold. The auditorium erupted into chaos. Parents shouted over each other, some defending Marcus, others calling for his resignation. In the midst of the uproar, Marcus saw Mrs. Granger slip out of the room, her face unreadable. As security moved to restore order, Marcus caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. It was Sarah Thompson, the parent who had approached him earlier with information about the conspiracy against him. Their eyes met, and Sarah gave a slight nod. It was time. Marcus raised his hands, calling for silence. "I have something to share with all of you," he said, his voice cutting through the din, something that may shed light on why there's been so much resistance to change at Clearview. He nodded to Sarah, who stood and made her way to the front of the room. As she walked, she pulled out a USB drive from her pocket. "Mrs. Thompson has provided evidence of a coordinated effort to undermine my leadership and maintain the status quo at Clearview," Marcus announced. "This evidence implicates several staff members and parents in a conspiracy to sabotage our efforts at inclusivity and diversity." The room fell deathly silent. Mr. Benson's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between Marcus and the exit. As Sarah plugged in the USB drive, the projector screen flickered to life. Emails, text messages, and recorded conversations filled the screen, laying bare the extent of the conspiracy. There was Mr. Benson, caught on camera discussing ways to discredit Marcus. There were emails from influential parents, including Thornton, strategizing how to force Marcus out. And at the center of it all, orchestrating every move, was Mrs. Granger. The evidence was damning, leaving no room for doubt. As the last email faded from the screen, a stunned silence fell over the auditorium. Marcus turned to face the crowd, his voice steady. "I came to Clearview with hope. Hope that we could build a better future for all our students. Instead, I found a system so entrenched in its biases that it would rather destroy itself than change." He paused, his eyes finding Jasmine in the crowd. She sat tall, her chin raised defiantly against the whispers surrounding her. "But I refuse to give up," Marcus continued, "because this isn't just about me. It's about every student who has ever felt out of place here. It's about creating a world where my daughter, and every child like her, can thrive without having to fight for their right to exist in spaces like this." As he spoke, Marcus saw a shift in the room. Parents who had been vocally opposed to his policies now looked ashamed. Students who had remained silent in the face of injustice began to stand, one by one, in a show of solidarity. Mr. Benson, seeing the tide turn, made a desperate lunge for the podium. "This is all a lie," he shouted. "Hayes is trying to destroy everything we've built." Security moved to restrain him, but not before he reached Marcus. In the scuffle that followed, Jasmine rushed forward, placing herself between her father and Mr. Benson. "Stop it!" she cried, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Can't you see what you're doing? This is exactly why we need change." The room froze. In that moment, seeing his 12-year-old daughter stand up against years of systemic injustice, Marcus felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly brought him to his tears. As security led Mr. Benson away, the door burst open. Mrs. Granger strode in, her face a mask of fury. "You think you've won, don't you, Hayes?" she spat. "But you have no idea how deep this goes. I've been protecting this school's legacy for decades, and I won't let you destroy it now." Marcus met her gaze, unflinching. "No, Mrs. Granger, you haven't been protecting a legacy. You've been preserving a system of oppression, and it ends today." With those words, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Mrs. Granger wasn't just complicit in the conspiracy. She was its architect. She had been pulling the strings all along, using Mr. Benson and others as pawns in her game. As the reality of the situation sank in, the mood in the room shifted once again. Parents who had been on the fence now openly supported Marcus. Students began sharing their own stories of discrimination and bullying, emboldened by Jasmine's courage. In the midst of the chaos, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Angela, her eyes shining with pride and determination. "You did it," she whispered. "You broke through." Marcus shook his head. "We did it," he corrected, pulling Jasmine close. "All of us." As security escorted Mrs. Granger from the building, Marcus turned back to the microphone. The room fell silent, waiting for his next words. "Today marks a new beginning for Clearview Academy," he said, his voice strong and clear. "It won't be easy. Change never is. But together, we can build a school that truly lives up to its promise of excellence, not just for some, but for all." The applause that followed was deafening. As Marcus looked out over the sea of faces, some tear-streaked, some still skeptical, but all engaged, he knew that the Real work was just beginning. But for the first time since he'd stepped through those ornate doors, Marcus Hayes felt hope. Real, tangible hope for the future of Clearview Academy and for every student who would walk its halls. The battle had been won, but the war for true equality and justice was far from over. Yet as Marcus stood there, with his family by his side and a community finally ready to face its demons, he knew that they were on the right path. Change had come to Clearview Academy, and this time it was here to stay. Marcus Hayes stood at the window of his office, watching the sun rise over Clearview Academy's manicured grounds. The weight of the past few months pressed down on his shoulders, threatening to crush him. Mrs. Granger's revelation as the mastermind behind the conspiracy had shaken him to his core. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Angela stepped in, her eyes filled with concern. "You didn't come to bed last night," she said softly. Marcus turned, his face etched with exhaustion. "I couldn't sleep. Angela, I don't know if I can do this anymore. Maybe they were right. Maybe I'm not cut out for this." Angela's eyes flashed with determination. "Marcus Hayes, don't you dare give up now. You've come too far, fought too hard. Our daughter is watching you, learning from you. What message would quitting send?" Her words struck a chord. Marcus thought of Jasmine, of all the students who looked to him for hope. He couldn't let them down. "You're right," he said, straightening his shoulders. "It's time to end this, once and for all." As Marcus prepared for the emergency board meeting, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah Thompson, the parent who had provided the initial evidence against Mr. Benson. "Mr. Hayes, I have something you need to see. It's about Mrs. Granger." 30 minutes later, Marcus sat in his car, staring at the documents Sarah had given him. His hands shook as he read through emails, financial records, and transcripts of recorded conversations. The truth was far worse than he'd imagined. Mrs. Granger hadn't just been manipulating Mr. Benson. She'd been blackmailing him. The record showed years of coercion, threats, and cover-ups. Mr. Benson, for all his faults, had been a pawn in a much larger game. As Marcus drove to the board meeting, his mind raced. The evidence he now possessed could destroy Mrs. Granger, but it could also tear the school apart. He had to tread carefully. The boardroom was tense when Marcus arrived. Mrs. Granger sat at the head of the table, a picture of calm authority. Mr. Benson hunched in his chair, looking defeated. "Mr. Hayes," Mrs. Granger's voice dripped with false sweetness, "I hope you're prepared to tender your resignation today. It's clear that your progressive ideas aren't a good fit for Clearview." Marcus met her gaze, his voice steady. "Actually, Mrs. Granger, I have some information I'd like to share with the board." He began to lay out the evidence, watching as shock and disbelief rippled through the room. Mrs. Granger's facade cracked, her composure slipping with each revelation. "This is preposterous," she sputtered. "Mr. Benson, tell them how we've worked together to protect this school's legacy." All eyes turned to Mr. Benson. He looked up, his face a mask of shame and relief. "It's true," he said quietly. "All of it. Mrs. Granger has been blackmailing me for years. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. I was a coward." The room erupted into chaos. Board members shouted questions, demands for resignations flying. Through it all, Marcus remained calm, a steady presence in the storm. As security escorted Mrs. Granger from the building, Marcus turned to Mr. Benson. "Harold," he said softly, I can't condone what you've done, but I understand the pressure you were under. If you're willing to work with us, to truly embrace change, there might be a place for you here still." Mr. Benson looked up, his eyes brimming with tears. "Why would you give me a second chance?" Marcus smiled sadly. "Because everyone deserves the opportunity to grow, to become better. That's what education is all about, isn't it?" In the weeks that followed, Clearview Academy underwent a transformation. With Mrs. Granger gone and Mr. Benson working to make amends, Marcus was able to implement the changes he dreamed of. Diversity training became mandatory for all staff. The curriculum was overhauled to include a wider range of perspectives and experiences. A zero-tolerance policy for bullying was strictly enforced. But the real change came in the small moments. Marcus watched as students who had once been isolated found their voices. He saw friendships form across racial and social divides. And he witnessed the slow, sometimes painful, but ultimately beautiful process of a community learning to see and value each of its members. One afternoon, as Marcus walked the halls, he overheard a conversation that made him pause. "Did you hear?" a student whispered. "Jasmine Hayes stood up to those kids who were picking on the new girl. She told them off right in front of everyone." Marcus felt a surge of pride. His daughter was carrying the torch, fighting for justice in her own way. That evening, as the Hayes family sat down to dinner, Jasmine couldn't contain her excitement. "Dad, you should have seen it. Those bullies didn't know what hit them. And the new girl, Aisha, she's really cool. We're going to study together this weekend." Marcus exchanged a glance with Angela, both of them beaming with pride. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," Marcus said. "You stood up for what's right, even when it was hard." Jasmine grinned. "I learned from the best." As the school year drew to a close, Marcus stood on the stage at the annual award ceremony. The auditorium was packed, a sea of faces reflecting the diversity he'd worked so hard to foster. "When I first came to Clearview Academy," he began, "I saw a school steeped in tradition, but resistant to change. I saw students who felt invisible, staff who were afraid to rock the boat, and a system that perpetuated inequality." He paused, looking out over the crowd. "But today, I see something different. I see a community that has faced its demons and chosen to grow. I see students who stand up for each other, regardless of their differences. I see staff who embrace new ideas and challenge their own biases." Marcus's eyes found Jasmine in the crowd, sitting tall and proud. Change isn't easy. It requires courage, compassion, and a willingness to be uncomfortable. But the rewards, they're immeasurable. As applause filled the auditorium, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The battle wasn't over. There would always be more work to do, but they had turned a corner. Later that night, as Marcus tucked Jasmine into bed, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Dad," she said, "do you think things will ever really change? Like everywhere?" Marcus sat on the edge of her bed, considering his words carefully. "I don't know if we'll see change everywhere in our lifetimes, sweetheart. But I do know this. Every small act of kindness, every stand against injustice, it all adds up. We might not change the whole world, but we can change our corner of it. And that's a pretty good start." Jasmine nodded, satisfied. As Marcus turned off her light and closed her door, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The next morning, as he walked into Clearview Academy, Marcus paused at those ornate doors that had once seemed so intimidating. He remembered the weight of 1,000 judgments he'd felt on that first day. But now he felt the weight of hope, of possibility, of a future where every child could walk through those doors and feel like they belonged. Marcus smiled to himself as he pushed open the doors. "Funny," he murmured. "I thought this was about my daughter's education, but turns out some people needed a lesson in respect." And with that, Marcus Hayes stepped into Clearview Academy, ready to face whatever challenges the new day might bring. Because he knew now, without a doubt, that change was possible. And it started with one person, one act of courage, one step at a time.